Welcome to the latest session of the Schaufler Lab TU Dresden videocast series. I'm your moderator for today, Andrew Erickson, a science fiction critical futures in technology scholar and a PhD candidate. The Schaufler Lab organizes a cohort of doctoral and postdoctoral researchers like me, as well as affiliated more senior scholars who work across the intersections of humanities, social sciences, and the arts. Under the guiding theme of data worlds, the present cohort is particularly interested to think about how environments are shaped by forces of extraction and datafication, as well as the increasingly dominating narratives that surround data management practices. The videocast series comprises individual sessions where we invite a guest speaker to give a recorded presentation, followed by a moderated discussion, which then goes up on our YouTube channel. And there will also be an unrecorded informal Q&A with cohort. Previous sessions have explored research on digital theology and data beliefs, archives, and as infrastructures, reappropriating noise in Gen AI art, as well as the production of speculative fiction, both as practices of critical AI literacy, and the social aspects of technological design. You can, and you definitely should, check out all of these excellent presentations and conversations at the links below. Today's session focuses on yet another crucial aspect of data worlding as it pertains to how human beings are increasingly viewed through and as data. I am delighted that the guest scholar for this session, a dear friend and excellent scholar, Dr. Réka Patrícia Gál, as a special treat, is here live in the lab with me in Dresden. Dr. Gál will take us through the first strike in space as a case study in how even astronauts in space are monitored through data that has been extracted from and claims to represent them, and how this functions to co-create subjectivity and reality. Réka Patrícia Gál is a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Science, Technology and Society at Technische Universität München. She completed her doctorate at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Information. In her doctoral research, she mapped the genealogies of technological maintenance and care labors related to US-American human spaceflight, focusing on the implications of human-machine interdependence in outer space, as it relates to issues of labor and environmental justice. Her research has been funded by the Deutsche Akademische Austauschdienst, the Ontario Graduate Scholarship, the University of Toronto's Centre for Culture and Technology, and the Critical Digital Humanities Initiative. She completed her master's in cultural history and theory at Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin. Together with Petra Löffler, she is the co-editor of Earth and Beyond in Tumultuous Times, a critical atlas of the Anthropocene, published by Mason Press. Réka's work unites feminist media theory, decolonial technoscience, and environmental anthropology to explore how technological tools and scientific methods are employed to purportedly solve sociopolitical problems. Her current research focuses on the environmental and labor justice implications of long-term human spaceflight. Together with her colleagues in the Anthropology of Science and Technology team at the department, she is working on an ethnographic research project on green, sustainable chemistry as part of the research program, Knowledge After Progress. And I'm delighted now to welcome Dr. Réka Gál to the Schaufler Lab and to give us your presentation.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. Here's my presentation. So spaceflight is often narrated as a triumph of human exceptionalism, a domain where the human body, properly trained and technologically supported, can transcend its earthly limits. But if you listen closely to the fragments that are left behind in transcripts, technical emission reports, and astronaut oral histories, another story emerges. One that is less about transcendence and more about the infrastructures that press against the contours of human life and needs in orbit. The continuous hum of teleprinters that proliferate daily schedules, and the cameras that never blink, the radios that are always listening. In this talk, I'm going to revisit the history of what has popularly been called the first strike in space, which occurred on the first US-American space station, Skylab, launched into space on May 14th, 1973. After ongoing disputes with ground control on the morning of 28th December 1973, on their first day off in 41 days on the station, the third and final crew of Skylab Orbital Workshop, consisting of Gerald P. Carr, Edward Gibson, and William R. Pogue, missed one of their scheduled communication passes with Mission Control in Houston. The station's silence has since become an infamous subject of public discourse, with some journalists and later commentators mythologizing it as a strike or class war in space. Some others have denied that it took place, terming it an urban legend. The astronauts themselves dispute that this break in communication was intentional labor action, instead claiming that on their first day off, they simply forgot to communicate over that communication pass. However, regardless of whether or not this break in communication was intentional, one thing is clear. This missed communication ultimately allowed the astronauts to renegotiate their labor conditions with ground control, such as getting a day off every 10 days, no exercise being scheduled after meals, and more downtime for rest and relaxation in the mornings and evenings. Skylab, developed at the end of the Apollo era, was envisioned as a cost-efficient, long-duration orbital laboratory. Engineers repurposed an extended Saturn rocket stage into a pressurized habitat, transforming it into a laboratory in the sky equipped with extensive recording and transmission systems. These technologies continuously relayed audiovisual and biomedical data to ground control, while the astronauts followed tightly scheduled routines that included medical protocols to track their physiological adaptation to microgravity. On Skylab, the astronauts themselves were basically once subjects, scientists, and specimens. Every aspect of their lives in space was quantified and qualified to produce extraterrestrial knowledge. While their lives and bodily functions were monitored through the all-encompassing surveillance on board, their daily schedules were carefully pre-planned by experts at ground control and uplinked to them via a teleprinter. The astronauts were therefore profoundly technologically surveilled and had really limited agency while on board the station. The aim of my talk is to use this case study of this style of strike as an analytical starting point to examine the labor politics of communication technologies during human spaceflight and their effects on astronaut subject formation. Drawing on oral histories, NASA technical reports, mission planning documents, flight schedules, I combine a historical reconstruction of in-flight events with a materialist analysis of a station's communication and monitoring infrastructures to analyze how these technologies contributed to a form of labor discipline that sustained really a specific type of astronaut subjectivity. Disciplined, transparent, and efficient, able to labor under conditions of law autonomy and continuous technocratic oversight and control from afar. To conduct my analysis, I draw on two complementary theoretical frameworks: Pecker et al.'s concept of the circuit and Michel Foucault's concept of subjectivation. In The Prison House of the Circuit, Pecker et al. Draw on Foucauldian concepts of governmentality, power, and subjectivity to argue that conditions of globalization and new forms of technical media, such as those involved in predictive policing, driverless cars, smart glasses, have brought about an emergent form of power relation, which is what they call the circuit. The authors conceptualize the circuit as a modern technological mode of governance that manages, produces, and monitors flows of both materials and information to minimize risk and ensure predictable outcomes. The authors argue that these modern data-driven, algorithmically managed technological assemblages have not so much erased the human body as incorporated it, making humans no longer end users of technology, but internal, in-circuited subjects whose role is to sustain the circulation of data. They claim that the circuit aims to produce a perfect state of security by removing human noise from governmental communication channels. But they also point out that because the circuit depends on human bodies as parts of its technological apparatus, it must render those bodies docile, which it does by proliferating media and discourse that can be captured and used experimentally to refine and expand the circuit. Using Pecker et al.'s concept of the circuit, I understand Skylab's onboard technologies, its crew, the ground-based infrastructures, and the ground controllers as comprising basically an archetypal, complex, large-scale socio-technical system within which the astronauts functioned as integral components to keeping the flow of information going between the ground and space station. Ultimately, I argue that Skylab 4's breaking communication was not really a one-off strike, but rather one of the two significant moments when the crew resisted their subjectivation as functionally machinic integral components of this circuit. They resisted exactly the type of subjectivation that Beckett argue or is what the human undergoes within the circuit, becoming a moment of mediality, messengers who disappear into the mission's data message to keep information moving between orbit and Earth so that the circuit can be continuously defined and more productive and more secure. Skylab 4 experienced issues with the data-driven control mechanisms embedded in the designs of communication technologies and mission planning immediately upon arrival on the station. Pogue, who alone among the three had taken the anti-nausea medication recommended by ground control, experienced nausea and eventually vomited. NASA's medical protocol technically requires all unexpected medical events to be reported to ground control, and it also requires that any expelled bodily fluids, such as vomit or stool, be preserved for later analysis. However, as Carl Rader recalled, the crew decided they did not want to get people all fuzzed up down on the ground, and rather than report the event, they disposed of the vomit bag through the trash airlock. Gibson later referred to the incident as the big barf cover-up. The biomedical monitoring developed for spaceflight, such as these routine collections of stool, urine, and mouth swabs, served basically a dual function for NASA. They both enable scientists to study physiological adaptation to conditions of microgravity and heightened radiation, and to estimate and react to medical risks that astronaut subjects might be experiencing during these missions. However, in doing so, these protocols also contributed to an astronaut subjectivity that required complete transparency, foreclosing the astronauts' ability to exercise agency over their own bodily functions. These daily medical protocols functioned as the ceremony of what Foucault calls the objectivization of the sheer fact of being alive in natural history or biology, which ultimately produced what Foucault has referred to as the calculable man, a highly disciplined, productive, and docile subject whose biological functions were integrated into mission telemetry. For Foucault, medical institutions and the fields of medicine's turning of human lives into calculable data points allows institutions to use normative categorical divisions, such as sick and healthy, med and sane, which ultimately leads to the subject being divided inside himself or divided from others. The crew's attempt to prevent this biological event from being captured as quantifiable data can be understood as what Foucault refers to as a refusal of abstractions and a refusal of the scientific and administrative inquisition, which determines who one is. Pogue's nausea and vomiting represented the ultimate human noise that Becker et al. Described, an irreducible bodily fallibility that the circus seeks to eliminate because it produces uncertainties. Gibson later suggested that the crew felt that already the ground medical team's insistence that they take prophylaxis reflected broader institutional anxieties. At the time, NASA was seeking continued congressional support in the wake of the Apollo program and already eyeing funding for the Space Shuttle program. Astronaut productivity in orbit thus bore a deep political economic weight. To receive long-term support, the mission had to demonstrate that the usefulness of sending humans into space. And for this, the astronaut subject had to be productive while on the space station. When Pogue became ill, the crew instinctively recognized that reporting the incident would shift Pogue's position from the category of a productive subject to that of an abnormal, because unproductive, subject, could potentially disrupt the mission, threatening both crew status and broader institutional goals tied to demonstrating productivity. However, the crew's attempt at this resistance was undone by what Gibson later referred to as the Nixon problem. Pogue, who was in charge of the communication system, had left the intercom recording switch on so that while they slept, their conversations about deciding that they're not going to report the incident were downlinked to their ground control. Gibson's nod to the Watergate tapes illustrates that the astronauts understood the station as a quasi-panoptic, highly surveyed environment that rendered them transparent to the ground crew. Both their bodily functions and even their intended private occurrences would later become subject to administrative review. The fallout that they experienced was stern and public reprimand by Alan Shepard over the crew's fairly serious error in judgment. Shepard did not simply reprimand the astronauts, though. He did so in an open communications line, which invited the public to be privy to this disciplining action. Anyone on Earth with their radio turned to the right frequency could listen in, including journalists. With this in mind, Shepard's reprimand can basically be understood as a public shaming ritual, an attempt to use the astronauts' fear of being marked as an abnormal subject to force them into obedience. The affordances of the audiovisual surveillance and the transparent communication channels imply this required submission to the astronauts' instrumentalized subjectivity, because going against it would have required communicating on an open line, which they knew could discredit or humiliate them in the eyes of the whole nation. In this respect, Skylab's communication infrastructure restricted their very conditions for descent. As Mukesh Chimambat argues, outfitting space habitats with pervasive surveillance infrastructures carries the risks of depriving inhabitants of open spaces to gather, debate, and dissent without draconian oversight, effectively turning them into surveillance states. Here, the transparent communication infrastructure in Skylab made these infrastructures effectively absent. The Skylab crew apologized and resumed work, but tensions with ground control persisted. Once their experiments became in earnest, the crew quickly realized that their schedules were basically unmanageable. Tasks accumulated faster than they could complete them, forcing them to extend work hours and sacrifice sleep. Carr later stated, "That went on for many, many days, and it was hard on our morale to be rushed like that and not be able to get things done, get them completed, get the experiments done. We were sure that the experimenters on the ground were grinding their teeth when we would have to report, well, I didn't get this experiment done because in my rush I put the wrong filter in, or I did this or I did that." We found that it was almost to the point where you had to schedule a time when you could go to the bathroom. It was that tightly scheduled. While the cameras and the microphones implicitly communicated the knowledge of constant visibility to the astronauts, it was through the teleprinter that the astronauts' daily schedules and task directives were communicated in orbit. The teleprinter delivered minute sequence task lists that partitioned the astronauts' dates into precise 5-minute blocks. This created what Ed Gibson later called micromanagement to the 9th degree, where the flight schedule's extensive use of time aimed to synchronize the human space with an optimal space prescribed by ground control. Morale level. Skylab's teleprinter operated through a thermal printing technique on standard thermal-coated military paper that was designed for use in spaceflight. It was selected for its durability under conditions of heightened radiation, compliance with flammability requirements, and quality of legibility in space. Skylab 2, the first Skylab crew, was provided altogether with 156 rolls of this paper, allowing them to receive approximately 7 million 5-letter words. The affordances of this teleprinter being used to communicate daily task instructions materialized for the astronauts as lengthy printouts, with the instructions regularly stretching 2 meters long. However, Gibson recalls a day when the flight schedule sent up by the teleprinter was 20 meters long, requiring the astronauts to cut it up and hand out detailed instructions sheet by sheet. But the lengthiness of instructions that the teleprinter could communicate to the astronauts was not its only affordance that deeply impacted their labor conditions. As an analysis of Skylab's communication system dates, the station was outfitted with systems that allowed voice to and from Earth, data to and from Earth, and command from Earth. As the phrasing highlights, the two-way radio communications and the systems used for sharing data with Earth were separate from the one-way communication system that ground control used to convey astronauts' daily schedules. Using a separate one-directional system for the flight schedule enabled flight controls to issue detailed minute-sequence commands without affording the astronauts an equivalent mechanism to modify or negotiate their schedules, and by extension, their daily lives. In this sense, the teleprinter's affordances enclosed its disciplinary function over the astronauts. Unlike the two-way voice communication, the one-way teleprinter does not talk back to Earth. Becker et al. Note that within the circuit, control over the switch, which they call basically the capacity to alter or halt the flow of information within, is central to the exercise of power. While designers and users are given access to manipulate the system, the encircuited subject is often denied access to its points of interruption and reconfiguration. By transmitting commands in one direction only, the teleprinter removed the astronaut's access to the switch, and thereby the ability to modify or disconnect from the circuit of labor. Within the socio-technical system Skylab, this power rested firmly with flight planners. Unfortunately for the astronauts, the flight planners of Skylab missions regularly underestimated the time that the crews required to perform tasks, including housekeeping, which caused tasks to spill over into one another. Resting, pausing, and the simple pleasures of existing in unstructured time outside of the requirements of value-producing labor. Skylab astronauts' statements encapsulate a central tension at the heart of the station's socio-technical system. The astronauts were both human operators and treated as instrumentalized components that made the station function. What emerges with increasing clarity through the archival documents and oral history interviews are the outlines of an astronaut subject as an instrument, a technology, a Sprecher et al. Note about the human subject within the circuit, a moment of mediality, a mere extension of the ground crew, who is simply expected to, as Gibson recalls, push the buttons as fast as they can and move on to the next. Oral history interviews with Skylab astronauts indicate that they even understood themselves to be treated as effectively machinic. Carr explicitly compares his time on Skylab to working in a factory, stating that it's a testimony to the human condition. Henry Ford probably learned it on the assembly line. The assembly line can only go so fast before you start making mistakes. Carr's metaphor collapses this distance between industrial labor and work in orbit, situating the astronaut within a longer history of workers being synchronized to machines. Like the workers in Marx's critique of automation within large-scale industry, the astronauts were becoming mere conscious organs of a larger socio-technical automaton, integrated into the system as functional elements whose primary role was merely to sustain the flow of data between the spacecraft and the ground. At the time at NASA, this approach to the astronauts was justified by a long-standing view of humans as unreliable in extreme environments, reinforcing efforts to monitor, regulate, and partially automate their behavior. Yet astronauts' retrospective reflections highlight the limits of this approach. As Edward Gibson later concluded, a key lesson of the Skylab 4 was the need to treat people like humans. The mission thus exposed a central tension in human spaceflight between the astronauts as a living and an embodied subject and as an instrumentalized component within a tightly controlled technological system. Here it is useful to once again return to Peck et al., who argue within the logic of the circuit, the human, to be understood both as a human subject and also all the things that make us human, is treated as mere noise that must be filtered out in order to be rendered docile in a Foucauldian sense. Gibson's retrospective assessment of the mission underscores this exact tension. Upon reflecting on the labor issues experienced by Skylab 4, he states that for him, the central lesson was to treat people like humans. Hogue likewise says his experiences during a flight made him much more inclined towards humanistic feelings towards other people, other crewmen. I now try to put myself into the human situation instead of trying to operate like a machine. Carr summarizes the crew's state at the time by saying, we just weren't getting the right kind of rest. We weren't getting the kind of leisure time that would allow us to do the right kind of job. Their breaking point occurred on December 28, 1973, when, as I mentioned, after 41 days without a break, they finally took a day off. Then what followed became the infamous subject of public discourse. The protocol requires that once over every pass over Earth, which occurs roughly every 90 minutes, the astronauts have to check in with ground control again. However, on this day off, the crew did not communicate with ground during one of its orbits. This is the issue that has become widely mythologized as intentional resistance, with a journalist called Henry S.F. Cooper categorizing the event in the New Yorker on the 22nd of August, 1976, as deliberate action by the crew. And then later, the Harvard Business School published a case study that designated it as the first strike in space. Kerr himself substantiates the claims that the crew was overworked and there was ongoing animosity between ground control and his crew, but he firmly declares that the communication with the ground was unintentionally cut off. However, I think for our purposes, rather than debate whether this action was intentional, what is important is that this non-communication allowed the crew to renegotiate their working conditions. This is the failed communication that prompted a frank discussion with ground control that allowed them to push for the days off every 10 days, the scheduling of no workouts after days, and increasing downtime before and after sleep. As one flight planner later stated, our first mutiny in space was caused by us in the flight planning world, demonstrating an understanding even on the side of ground control afterwards that the mission planning assumed astronauts could function as continuously productive components with minimal rest for sleep or autonomy. But crucially, these reforms really only emerged once the communication with the circuit between orbit and ground control was broken. The surveillance on the station was at the time not instantaneous. On board, a recorded voice communication was dumped via VHS transmitter once per pass, roughly every 90 minutes. However, the data tapes and their transcripts were only available 24 hours after each pass. This means that these communication passes were really a crucial component of maintaining ground control's continuous oversight over the station. If we take seriously Becker et al.'s argument that the core aim of the circuit is to ensure seamless, predictable flow of data in order to manage risks and secure predictable outcomes, then the crew's failure to respond can be understood as effectively disrupting this feedback loop, creating what can be understood as an open circuit, a temporary disconnection that prevented the seamless flow of information on which the system depended. In doing so, the astronauts, whether intentionally or unintentionally, withdrew themselves from the regime of constant monitoring and productivity, forcing the system to recognize its own limits. The cost of Skylab 4's refusal was their career, however. Despite having proved to have been the most effective of the three crews, they were never again selected or considered part of astronaut selection for future missions. Their refusal broke the circuit's primary requirement, predictability. By proving that they could exist outside of the ground's oversight of the station, they became marked as unreliable components in this automated regime. However, I think what the widespread politicization of this event as a strike in historiographic accounts and public discourse misses is exactly the politics, that is, the societal power dynamics at play of the affected parties. The Skylab astronauts were not really labor activists challenging the total administrative state of Skylab. They were white, male, elite members of that state, demanding the right to function effectively within it. Feminist and anti-racist scholarship has long demonstrated the capacity to be recognized as human, as opposed to being violently thrust into categories of inhuman or technology, has historically been unevenly distributed along axes of gender, race, ability, etc. Colonialism and capitalism have historically redrawn the lines around whiteness and maleness as exclusive categories of the human. When they rejected being treated as machines, they were rejecting a status that has been forced in indigenous, Black, and racialized populations as surrogate humanity for a very long time. And so I think the disruptive potential of this strike lies not in the astronauts really having achieved more time for self-care as like an emancipatory end. Their elite status allowed them to successfully advocate for adjustments without challenging the hierarchical organization of spaceflight itself. Their negotiation for humanistic treatment merely recalibrated the technological rationality rather than escaping it. Rest was still operationalized, scheduled, and reintegrated to ensure a broader mission of maintaining a permanent human presence in space. The legacy of Skylab 4 actually also reflects this limited transformation. While later missions, such as those on the ISS, feature shorter workdays and more scheduled rest, the underlying system remains intact. Centralized planning, continuous monitoring and datafication, and limited crew autonomy persist. So I think the transformative analytical potential of this strike lies elsewhere. It lies in showing exactly that the treatment of Skylab astronauts as machines, despite their whiteness and maleness, exposes the extent to which the gendered and colonial history of US American spaceflight have contributed to both the technological designs and mission planning that render space itself a domain of whiteness and masculinity, not only in terms of representation, but also ontologically. The efforts to synchronize bodies to schedules, to translate the living and non-living beings of the land, both here on Earth and in space, into data, and to turn this data into productive action in order to minimize the uncertainties that are kind of inherently associated with biological existence and a continuously shifting universe, point to a deeper investment in a form of life that privileges control, predictability, and extraction. I think as we're looking towards more increased presence in outer space, more privatization, it's quite important for us to think about what the outcomes are of the technological systems that are being designed, what the companies that are planning on sending more people into space are imagining what a human life in outer space can become. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this rich, multi-layered talk. You hit on a number of key aspects that I think are essential to the critical moment in which we're finding ourselves, right? So on the one hand, a history of racialization and the implementation of labor towards certain kinds of bodies, and on the other hand, the right to respond to that. Thanks very much for that. I want to open the discussion round with a really broad question. That's a little bit unfair. And I think one of the things that I think about in these kinds of case studies in particular that are often thinking from a more mathematically grounded background, the sort of optimization, categorization of people, and the idea that someone can be continuously optimized, right? What's the value in particular of bringing humanities background and a social sciences background to bear on that? What are the affordances of the toolkit that we have from our domain to both document these episodes, these trends, these imaginaries, and then also to respond to them? Is it just a clash of values, like from a more mathematical to a more humanity-focused mindset, or is there something more to it?
I really think it's both in a sense that, both within social sciences and humanities, depending on what you're looking at it, we are given analytical tools that allow us to understand how these things happen. So for those of you who are historians, there is a way that you can actually understand how we have gotten to this place. But I also think that it comes down to, in that sense, truly this ontological difference. So what we think life should be, what we think our role is in existence, and what we think we are working towards as a world, basically. And so it's both in a sense that you can, from the toolkit that we get, like a critical toolkit that we get from social sciences and humanities, we can diagnose what the problem is. But we also are able to point out that otherwise can exist, and that there are ways in which we could actually configure life, both here on Earth and in outer space, in ways that are not in line with this technological rationality that essentially wants to turn everything into data that can be then continuously controlled better to make more predictable.
Thank you so much for that. I completely agree. Just as an aside, so in a sense, I want to take us kind of to like the space of regulation, of thinking about how this came to be. Like we didn't, as you point out, this is contingent, right? Like a certain set of historical processes led us to a place where we get into this optimization, this categorization, turning human experiences of being in the world into something abstract, out there data that we can kind of manipulate in all these different ways. I'm going to think about the things that regulate this. I'm thinking about legal structures that are in place. Right, in a sense, this to me is a classic labor dispute. You brought up some other examples, right? So there's a discrepancy between some kind of corporate overlord and then the workers, right? Both have ideas about what's reasonable work, about what you can actually achieve as a human being interacting with material environments in the world. And we have myriad examples of this, right? Amazon's debates is maybe not the right word, dispute with its factory workers or with its delivery drivers. Uber's attempt to prevent its so-called gig workers from unionizing, right? We have a myriad of examples of this. And then if we go even farther back, you bring up, very importantly, enslavement, right, along racial lines. Like we have a long history of working in these sort of abstract ways to control material environments and the people who dwell in them. What kinds of legal structures or what kinds of policy, maybe as a better way to frame this, as non-legal experts, exist? What have enabled this? And how is that different if we think about different localities, right? Obviously, this is NASA, so we're dealing with a US-based set of labor laws, which tend to be very fluid and often benefit corporations over workers, versus bringing this back here to Germany, where we're having this conversation where we have much stronger unions, theoretically, much stronger unions that protect workers from this kind of exploitation, if that's the right word. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, so I think that like in the history of space, it's already quite interesting to see that the productivity of astronauts and trying to demonstrate that US astronauts could be productive in space is also in some ways, particularly during the Cold War, was part of like an ideological struggle between the Soviet Union and capitalism and technocratic rationality on the side of the US, right? So there's an extent to which I think what is also interesting here, particularly if I'm looking at the way that the astronauts are themselves realizing that they're part of this machine and they're using all of these examples that can almost be seen as like labor critiques, but then at the same time, there's such an insistence on not having done this intentionally. We were trying to be really good subjects. We really were trying. It just like came to a point where essentially our bodies prevented us from doing this. And you can debate the extent to which you want to take at face value documents that are produced by NASA, because a lot of these oral history interviews are by JSC, the Johnson Space Center. But I think that there's also something really interesting in the way that astronauts subjectivate themselves as right subjects and what it means for them to understand their role in furthering this type of thing, right? In saying, I myself believe that this is the right way of existence, and I myself try to essentially mold myself to fit this type of subjectivity and say, I am very buying into becoming a machine myself, but there's like limits to which I can do this. I think, and it's quite interesting as well if you look at the history of Soviet spaceflight, which I'm not a full-on expert in, but documents from the 1960s from Soviet missions, granted translated into English, already talk about astronauts as being workers. And there's a lot of documents that are much more interested in dealing with what does it mean, the psychological impacts of being in space, what does it mean to essentially provide astronauts with an ability to be fulfilled subjects in space. And a lot of Soviet missions, particularly when a lot of cosmonauts also started being involved on missions in Mir and were working together with American astronauts already, lament basically the extent to which they're no longer allowed to be autonomous. So Russian astronauts were told what they need to do, but their days were not segmented into the same like 5-minute sequences. They had a specific task list that they had to get done, but it wasn't, you have 15 minutes to do this. It was much more of an understanding of you're working out there as a worker and you're the only one who knows actually what the conditions of your work are. And we're just going to trust that you do this. Not to say that they didn't experience issues, but there is a different approach to this. I think also particularly right now, there's two things, right? If we're thinking about this datafication and we're looking at the way that regulation is, for example, talking about what Artemis missions, which I don't know if any of you are familiar with, but it's basically the NASA push to go back to the moon and establish sustained human presence on the moon. If you look at the way that they are trying to define what we want to do in space as humanity, or what are places that they've described, for example, as safe zones in space, this is always geared towards saying what we determine as a safe zone in space is a place where industrial action is going to take place. And we determine it as a place where you cannot attack the workers, but it's not protecting the moon. It's not protecting the workers themselves. It's protecting the machinery, right? It's protecting the mechanism of extraction. That is, again, supposed to be creating this circuit between space, being able to get helium back to Earth, being able to extract lunar water ice to turn it into propellant and all these type of things. And so I think right now, particularly as well with how US regulation, both around workers' rights and around environmental protection is going, and that there's an increased push towards acceleration, where you're specifically using these words to say we need to speed up innovation. There's a real problem with a lot of the companies that are involved actually or have moved towards aerospace as a field. So Blue Origin, the company of Jeff Bezos, which anecdotally, apparently he only started Amazon to amass enough money to start Blue Origin because he took a class with Gerard O'Neill, who wrote The High Frontier, which is a really like neoliberal space utopia description. When he was at Princeton, and he realized that that was going to be the way that humanity needs to go. But then the other person, and we know the labor issues that Amazon workers are experiencing. And then the other person is Elon Musk, who also has really famously terrible working conditions at Tesla. And so I think that there is something about what it means that it was already an issue, particularly in the US, when it was ostensibly governmental spaceflight, which always included in some ways governmental or private contractors. But what it means if we're now moving towards basically company towns in space, and who is going to be defining what the conditions of that labor are. Elon Musk, for example, has very famously said he loves his workers in Tesla factories in Shanghai because they live there and work 12 hours a day, and that's how it should be. So.
Thanks so much for that. And thank you in particular for bringing us to kind of science fiction, or maybe more broadly, the sort of socio-political imaginaries that exist upon which ideas of workers in outer space rely, right? We have a myriad of these right across science fiction. The one that I think is probably most dominant when we start to talk about actual space colonization at the moment is the Apple TV series, right? The name of which I've immediately forgotten, For All Mankind, thank you. Which of course is playing on all of these imaginaries, but also is relying on a sort of corporatization of space flight, as well as drawing on the actual history of the Cold War US tensions. What are the most dominant and useful here, in a sense, not in terms of productivity, but useful in terms of the things that allow us to really understand what's going on here? What are the most useful social and political imaginaries that we have? What are the imaginative tools, whether it be fiction or something non-fictional, that really let us see what's actually happening?
Do you mean in terms of fiction that depicts the issues that are happening? So,
and the responses to
as another science fiction enjoyer, I think, for example, some of the depictions in The Expanse TV show were actually quite interesting, right? The way that they're describing both this like triangular trade, and I'm using this word because Robert Zubrin, who is the head of the Mars Society and has been a really big proponent of space colonization for a very long time, has always advocated for this triangular trade between Moon, the asteroid belt, and Earth. And he very famously calls it a triangular trade that used to exist in history, and fails to mention that that was literally the slave trade. And so I think there are things that you see in the way that The Expanse depicts what it has meant, both in terms of the physiological adaptations that happen to people, what it means to actually live long-term in outer space. Because I think also one of the things that you're forgetting, and sorry, this is like a small segue into something else, but if you're talking to astronauts right now, quite often they're going to say, we're not going to be able to live on Mars, not in 100 years, because we're barely learning how to live on the ISS. When we're talking about Moon, we don't know yet what it means to try to exist with the lunar regolith. The regolith is so abrasive that when the Apollo astronauts were up there and they had the dust, the lunar dust on their visors, if they tried to wipe it off, it basically frosted it. We don't know yet what it means to try to keep, a habitat clean of that. What happens if it actually comes inside? What does it do to someone's lungs? All these type of issues. I also think Mickey 17 was a really interesting depiction of the ways in which we imagine like remote laborers that can just be sent elsewhere and be really expendable human beings that are used for basically extraction. There's also a really interesting book by Olga, I forget the family name, called The Employees. Raven, yes. Where she's essentially depicting like robotic workers and their interactions with biological beings and what it has meant for them to live in space long term. Because I think that one of the things that is also important for us to keep in mind is like time scales here, right? What is it going to mean if we're trying to do this long term? What does it do to humanity, both on Earth and the people who are in space, if we actually live elsewhere? We have only known how to exist here, right? What does that do to us long term? Yeah.
It's a great question. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. We've been quite critical, I think. I'm also thinking here a little bit about how science works, right? And there is a real scientific impulse here. The more data that you have, the more you can know about something. What are the in this mode of surveillance and endless extraction, trying to understand everything about a body in space, since that's what we're talking about here, how do we tread the line? And this is an unfair question. How do we tread the line between scientific understanding of something and the corporate or governmental control of that information for completely different purposes, right? Science wants to know everything. Business is also interested to know everything, but for arguably very different goals. Like, is there a space in between? And how important is the right to opt out of that?
Okay, so I think that there's a couple of different things here. One, if you're looking at history of science and the ways in which it has been entangled with colonialism and capitalism, it's already quite important to say that I don't think necessarily saying that it's going to be entirely different with corporate understandings or that science has ever been really fully independent of that, right? If you're looking at funding structures historically, or if you're looking at, sciences, things that used to be considered scientific but are not scientific now, like eugenics, so much of the science that has been produced has been essentially also, it had a foundation of worldview understanding of what it means to, something is a resource. And so I think it also comes down to what we consider science and scientific, because the Western science that we know is not the only type of science that exists. And I think how we look at the world and beings of the world, be them, animate or inanimate, as we would call in the West, influences what we think science can do, what can be turned into data, and what does it mean to abstract things from their relations, basically. And then what was the second part of the question? I forgot.
I asked you if there was I asked about the importance to the right to opt out of surveillance and control mechanisms.
Right. Sorry. I also
the state and
and
corporate.
I realized. Okay. What I also wanted to say is I think that truly the tension that the astronauts were experiencing is partly indeed right. The idea that some of this is done for safety. It's done to say we don't want people to die in space because that would be bad. That would reflect really badly on us, what it means to actually get funding, for example, in the future, or get even like public support, right? If you're saying this is actually so dangerous that people are dying, what does it mean to try to tell people that this is something that we should be doing? So I think that tension also exists in a really material way of saying, what are the levels to which we want to ensure that people are okay medically? And what is the level of agency that we give people who are in these type of like most extreme remote work conditions, right? The level of paternalism with that is what it comes down to, I think. And I don't know that I necessarily have an answer for it, because I also don't even know if I'm necessarily even for any of this. But I think that there's something here about what it means truly for creating a society in space. And, this comes down to like a whole different thing where there's a phenomenal scholar, oh God, whose name I'm forgetting right now, who has written about the different ways in which Bezos's view of what it means to colonize space is different from Elon Musk's view, and says one of them is more an understanding of like imperialism, where Earth is still the core, whereas for Musk, it's much more the dynamic of saying these are going to be like self-maintained separate states, right? And I think that even with that, there is an issue of saying, but whose autonomy, right? So if we're saying it's independent from Earth, but is it independent from the company? Like who is actually making these decisions, right? And I think then it comes down to the question of what would it even mean to give people who are going elsewhere the ability to make their decisions?
Thank you so much. That's an excellent question, I think, to end the recorded part of our discussion. I want to thank you again, Dr. Réka Gál, for being here with us at the Schaufler Lab. And for everyone checking this out, please also look at our other episodes. Thanks very much.